I think the crucial thing to begin with is that the revolution, the upheavals, the Syrian end of the Arab Spring, I think is entirely different to what we've seen before in terms of its implications. So far we've had upheavals in Tunisia, a reasonably marginal country, Libya, a fairly marginal country, Egypt clearly not marginal, with an impact on Hamas and aspects of the Palestinian situation. But nonetheless, as we've already heard from Fawaz, Syria is really the cockpit for a whole range of regional rivalries that have been developing in a major way, really ever since the Americans deposed the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I think it's crucial to bear in mind a sense of the geopolitical changes that have gone on in the region in recent years. You have the removal of Iraq, freeing Iran to become much more the sort of regional player that it has wanted to become. You have the rise of Turkey as a major regional actor. You have this Cold War, as it's been referred to, being played out against this so-called axis of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah and Hamas. Set against that, you have the Arab Spring, with all of the extraordinary expectations that has raised in Arab societies, the extraordinary economic problems that persist in many of those societies. And to an extent, although I think it's fair to say that over recent years, the principal strategic players in the region have been the three non-Arab actors, Iran, Israel and Turkey. The Arab Spring has prompted, for various reasons, something of a resurgence of Arab diplomacy, both in a sense to contain and curb the violence, to contain to some extent the contagion, but also to try and find a way that would give expression to the views of peoples in the region without the sort of upheavals that otherwise might occur. When we look at the international response to the Libya crisis, to the Syria crisis, the first question, I suppose, is, well, why is it not like Libya? Why hasn't the West done more? Why haven't other Arab actors done more? Why hasn't there been potentially some kind of military involvement? And I think, in a sense, to understand why it's not like Libya really does go a long way to explaining some of the difficulties that we face in Syria. Syria, as I've said, because of being a cockpit of all these regional tensions, it is central, it is not peripheral. The stakes are so much higher. The protesters in Syria, whatever you want to call them, rebels, whatever, don't hold territory in the way that they did in Libya. The opposition, for the time being, is much more divided, much less coherent, much less clear about what it wants to achieve. The stakes, one has to say, for the Europeans are rather different. There aren't waves of refugees about to head across the Mediterranean to Italy. So we're not likely to see this a repeat of this extraordinary moment where David Cameron became Tony Blair and President Sarkozy became a version of Napoleon, perhaps. There's no appetite or consensus for military action. What limited discussions there have been, you referred to the Turkish talk about buffer zones. Alain Juppé, the French foreign minister, has spoken about the humanitarian corridors. The Emir of Qatar more recently has spoken about Arab peacekeeping troops, but none of those ideas have really gained any traction, and not least because the military dynamics are so very different. The Syrians are much more capable militarily. A no-fly zone would be irrelevant. They're not particularly using their air force. The fighting, to a large extent, is in heavily populated urban areas. There are not wide open roads along the coast which would be amenable to attacking Syrian forces and so on. So it's quite clear that in an explicit sense there is not, as I agree with you, a military response to the crisis in Syria. When you look at the diplomatic response, it's been varied and rather halting and rather uneasy. Particularly in the West, I think you have to remember that President Assad was always seen as the potential reformer, as the man who you could do business with. I remember his appearance at the Bastille Day parade in France in 2008. France and other countries took a very prominent role in trying to encourage Assad on the path of reform. And this fixation that Assad was a man who could be persuaded to change, who could be persuaded to take things in a different direction, really persisted for quite a time into this crisis. It was only slowly and gradually that the realization came that he was an obstacle, that, as I think our own Foreign Secretary put it, Syria was at a fork in the road, and that ultimately you had Western leaders calling explicitly for Assad's removal, or calling for him to stand down. I think the West in particular was caught out by the speed with which the crisis militarized, as it were. I think they shouldn't have been, but they were caught out by the level of violence that the Syrian government was prepared to deploy. When you look at other reactions, the Arab League, which had taken a prominent role in at least facilitating the military intervention in Libya, and also some of the countries, Qatar in particular, a prominent role actually militarily. Whilst the Arab League has been fairly divided, and you mentioned that Lebanon and Iraq are perhaps rather more partial to supporting Assad than others, I think it has been a more impressive showing by the Arab League, up to a point, with all the limitations of the observer mission and so on. They have had a plan, they have been active. The question now is what they're going to put towards the UN Security Council and where diplomacy at the international level might go. Here I think, just as with the military option, there isn't much optimism for progress, not least because the Russians are determined to block any move at the UN Security Council. The Russians, interestingly, as a form of words, that the Russians have been much more willing to see this as a civil war in Syria than has the West. The West has generally wanted to portray this as an authoritarian government attacking its citizens. The Russians have been much more willing, as I say, to see it as a civil war, to stress the violence coming from both sides. We've mentioned the Russian arms delivery, the visit by a Russian aircraft carrier and its flotilla to the port of Tartus a short while ago. There is every indication that, in part because Assad is one of Russia's few strategic allies in the region, and secondly because the Russians feel very badly burnt over Libya, that the Russians are not going to accede to any resolution at the Security Council that might be seen potentially, at the very least, to open the way to conflict. Whether a change view from the Arab League, a démarche from the Arab League might encourage the Russians to accept some form of words, and there's been a lot of discussion about the wording of a potential resolution. Well, that's interesting. But here again, I don't think international diplomacy is necessarily going to go very far. I think inevitably we're going to see a long, drawn-out crisis of the regime in Syria with continuing violence. And I think if you look at that from a regional perspective, I think it raises some very, very worrying possibilities over the coming year or 18 months. I think there is a real danger in a region where there is such a concern about sectarianism, and I think it's in a sense a measure of the way in which events in Iraq have been etched into the Arab mind. I think there is a terrible danger of the spreading of a sort of arc of chaos through Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. In both Iraq and Lebanon, one has to say the governing arrangements are interim at the very best. There is a great danger with both Iran and Syria, with their backs to the wall at the same time, of some wider military conflict erupting in the region, be the source the Lebanese border or the Strait of Hormuz, or even potentially some events in Gaza. So I think the very linkages and the centrality of Syria are what makes events there so dangerous at the moment. And I'm afraid it's not an optimistic conclusion, but I think both on the military front, we've agreed that's a dead end. I'm not sure that Arab diplomacy in the long run has a great deal to offer, and I'm pretty sure that the wider international UN-based diplomacy doesn't have a deal to offer. What is being done? Well, potentially there could be, depending on how things develop, limited military involvement. Some argue that arms are already being supplied by Qatar and Turkey. The buffer zone could provide a haven for Syrians. It could provide a means of arming Syrian opposition groups, but that in the short run would only inflame the fighting. The Americans are seriously talking, belatedly perhaps, about the range of issues, the range of things that they might do to help the Syrian opposition. And I'm sure those conversations have been mirrored in other Western capitals. There are symbolic steps you can take. You can form contact groups to try and heighten the diplomatic awareness. You can step up ties with Syrian opposition groups and so on. But I think, sadly, this conflict has a very long way to run, and I see no external forces really being able to bring matters to a conclusion anytime soon.